So good morning, everybody. My name is Ginger Roberts Scott, working for the WIC program. Thank you so much for coming to our Lunch and Learn. This is part one of a two-part series on trauma and lactation. So in this session, we will be exploring the impact of trauma on new parents and on their capacity to chest feed. Chest feeding can be a particular challenge for those with trauma histories for a variety of reasons. And this training help those who work directly with parents, help them support them in initiating and sustaining chest feeding by recognizing and responding to challenges. Carrie, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to read the learning objectives, but I guess I will. Our learning objectives today, participants will recognize what a history of trauma looks like in people and understand triggers for survivors, particularly around chest feeding, and explore how to build relationships to support parents who may have experienced trauma with chest feeding. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Doyle, but first I want to tell you a little bit about her. Melissa Doyle, LCSW, she goes by she, her. She is the Director of Trauma-Informed Systems and Impact at the Maine Resilience Building Network, the folks that we've been working with to bring you some of these lunch and learns. Melissa works to promote trauma-informed systems in communities across Maine through training, technical assistance, and capacity building. In addition, Melissa brings her extensive experience working with individuals and organizations in recognizing and addressing vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress and building personal and organizational resilience. And that's, what you guys experience in the clinics. Melissa helps advance Merben's initiatives around cultivating youth mattering and promoting positive childhood experiences through her work as a HOPE, Healthy Outcomes Through Positive Experiences trainer and facilitator. We're actually going to be doing a lunch and learn on HOPE a little bit later, so that'll be fun to hear more about Melissa. A clinical social worker, Melissa brings 15 years of experience in the trauma and healthcare fields. Her clinical work focused on working with survivors of interpersonal and sexual violence. Melissa frequently presents on topics involving trauma, vicarious trauma, and positive childhood experiences. So, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, great. Thanks, Ginger. And I actually just joined by phone too, so I hopefully will see the chat. So if things pop up, I can see it. But again, if folks have questions, feel free to unmute and ask them throughout. And again, I know I've said it a couple of times, but for anyone who just joined, I will be back in 2 weeks for part 2 of this. And so any questions that you have or you want to ask specifics around, engagement, and that's what we'll be focusing a lot on in part 2. But ask away, and if we can't answer it today, we'll answer it in a couple of weeks. So Ginger shared all about what I do at Merben, the Maine Resilience Building Network. But one thing I just want to always caution folks on when we're talking about trauma or challenging experiences, it can be a really hard topic. And so please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. And, if you need to get up and take a break, that's always an option for you as we go throughout the presentation. So we'll spend about an hour, and Ginger talked about what we'll be talking about today. I'll just do a lot of the framing today, talking about what trauma is and trauma-informed care is, what it's not, and then how do we think about this specific impacts of trauma on parenting and around chest feeding and lactation, okay? And then next week, like I said, we'll talk more about engagement and thinking about how do we work with folks around trauma. So first, let's think, why even sort of have this session? And first, it's because trauma is very widespread. It has no boundaries, no one look. It doesn't affect only one group of people, right? It affects those who've experienced trauma directly, of course, but also friends and family members and those we love. And there are a myriad of ways that people can experience trauma. It's also incredibly expensive, so to our society and to individuals. But we know that the estimates of a total lifetime cost associated with just 1 year of confirmed cases of childhood maltreatment, lifetime cost is about $428 billion. So if we only had child abuse or child maltreatment in 1 year, it would still cost society, almost $4.5 billion just from all of the systems responses that have to happen, healthcare costs, law enforcement responses, lost wages, bringing folks to, counseling and therapy, victim assistance programs, a whole whole host of systems get involved, right? So it's incredibly expensive as a public health issue. And then, of course, it can inhibit typical growth and development throughout the lifespan. So not just at the time of trauma, but what are the impacts of it later on in life? And that, of course, is sort of what we'll be thinking about, especially with parenting. And we know that trauma-informed care is effective care, and it mitigates some of the impacts, both the financial impact, but also the psychological, the physical development, the brain development. And it really considers how relationships heal, right? And I know so many of you are sort of in the relationship building business, working with folks directly. And so I think this is really thinking about how in your role, how does trauma-informed practice consider healing, consider how you can work in a healing-informed way or in a healing way. So first, I think it's important that we take some time to define trauma and understand what it is. I know most of us have some sense, but some of us think of it more as a psychological impact, others as a physical impact to the body. So I kind of want to use a consistent definition. So I'm just curious, what do you think of when you hear the word trauma or that someone's experienced trauma? And you can just hold that in your head for a second if you want, but just take a minute and think of, when I hear trauma, what do I think of? All right. I use the definition that comes out of SAMHSA, and that is that it's an event or series of events that are experienced as physically or emotionally harmful, okay? And this is, to me, the important one, where the effects are lasting. And I think that's the critical piece, okay? Because we can all experience the same event, but because of a host of reasons, maybe our age, maybe our previous life experiences, our other stressors, the effects will be different for everybody. So it's not the event that is traumatic itself, it is what is the effect on us and what is the intersection with other experiences that determines if something is going to be traumatizing or not, okay? And so again, folks could all be in sort of a bus crash today, lots of different people, but not everyone will come out of that feeling traumatized. Okay, so the effects are lasting is an important piece. Trauma can be acute, a one-time event, right? Chronic, something that happens over time or over and over, and complex, where there's the intersection of traumas, okay? So we might experience one event at one point in our lives, and then there's intersecting trauma at another point. And this is sort of especially relevant for folks because in the sort of demographic we're talking about, because birth trauma is pretty common. And so that's often an intersecting and complex trauma for many folks. This is a chart or a picture that some old colleagues of mine at Brigham and Women developed, and actually it's even been updated since this picture. But what I like about what they've done is it just gives a sort of a big lens to what trauma is, right? Sometimes we get really focused on interpersonal trauma, and I'll be talking a lot about that today because it's especially relevant to our demographic. But trauma could be individual, right? Could happen. It could be a medical event. It could be interpersonal, or it could be collective. And probably next week, we'll talk more about the impact of collective trauma on lactation and chest feeding too. But this, I think, just gives us a big range to be thinking about, right? That it's not just maybe sexual abuse or not just domestic violence, but all of these other things can be traumatic for people. Okay, so it's a starting point to understand the breadth. Another way that we often hear about trauma, I think probably in our worlds, is through the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study or the ACEs study. So this might be familiar to many of you, but or you've heard about it in other trainings. But very briefly, it was a seminal study on the impact of how childhood trauma and adversity impacts adult physical and mental health. And so these are 10 types of adverse experiences. And of course, looking at the chart on the slide before, we know that there are many other types, but this helped us understand, this study really helped us understand, again, not just what's the impact of trauma at the point that it happens in, say, childhood, but how does it affect physical and mental health across the lifespan, okay? And what the study showed is that it, in fact, does. There are real causations and correlations, I should say, between early adverse experiences and adult physical and mental health. So I want to talk for a little bit about how trauma impacts healthy brains and healthy bodies. Okay, so brains are built over time, starting from the back. This is where it forms first, kind of way back there. That's sometimes called our reptilian brain, and it gets built from back to front. And so our most complex, sort of sophisticated part of our brain is right up here. It's our frontal lobe, and really our prefrontal cortex, which is kind of right at the very front. And then it's also built sort of from the middle to the sides out. And so the back of our brain, that reptilian brain, it's our most primitive, and it regulates things like heart rate and breathing, skills we're born with, and it does a lot of our unconscious work. And then in our early years, it's all about sensory motor development, that proliferation of brain cells. We get a ton of new brain cells that are forming in those first 12 to 18 months of life. We actually have brain cells that form throughout our lives, but there's this explosion that happens in those very early years. And then kids are learning through kinetic or tactile engagement, right? Largely using their senses to learn about the world. They're not verbal. And so little kids are concrete. They're pretty much only concerned about what's happening in front of them at that moment. And then in the preschool or early school age years, kids are learning to think about the past and the future, develop more abstract thinking, memory and imagination are being developed. And connections are forming in their brain based on experiences. And those are really exploding in those early preschool years. And then later elementary age, maybe 7 to 11, is when those frontal and temporal lobes really start to develop. And that's when kids really start to process auditory information and encode memory. So that makes sense, right? It's the front part and the side part. And then the temporal lobes also play an important role in processing affect and emotions and language. Adolescence or puberty is when the frontal lobes, that's prefrontal cortex, that's when that really starts growing and developing. That's why our teenagers are really only very intermittently competent, because their prefrontal cortex is just starting to grow. This is where we locate problem solving, emotion regulation. But the full maturation of our brain doesn't happen until our late 20s, at least until like 27. So if you're working with young adults, they're still not fully mature, even though they might be holding down jobs and parenting and all that. Their brain is not fully formed or fully grown. We used to think it ended around 21-ish, 22, 23, but now we know that there's maturation happening much later into our 20s. And I tell you all of this because it's important to understand a couple things about trauma in the brain. And how it impacts our functioning and decision making, not just, again, at the time of the trauma, but through our lifespan, if left unattended or unmitigated. If trauma and adversity occurs at any of these different developmental stages, it can impact our ability to develop the skills associated with that stage, okay? So, for example, a 4-year-old is learning about how their behavior can change or should change if they're in a classroom versus a library, say, versus a playground. If they experience trauma at this stage of development, right, not only do they have trouble with the development of those skills, but any subsequent skills that rely on those foundational skills can be challenged, okay? And so we think about it, if somebody experiences trauma or abuse at that, say, 4-year-old age, right? And there's not buffer, there's not support for that kid, that ability to learn how do I act in different spaces may be sort of challenging for that person throughout their lifespan if they don't get any sort of protective experiences or buffering or intervention that would allow them to learn those skills at some other point, if that makes sense. So that 4-year-old might be having struggles, right? But also that 20-year-old might be struggling, or that 30-year-old might struggle with that too. And we know that early childhood trauma has been associated with a reduction in sort of the brain cortex as well, the sort of whole brain, or a lot of the brain, which is responsible for a lot of complex functioning around memory, attention, perceptual awareness. So again, if you're experiencing trauma, those parts of your brain that regulate in those areas may be impacted, okay? So kids and adults might struggle with attention or curiosity or language development, abstract reasoning skills, okay? Which impacts how folks learn how to cope and tolerate distress, right? Their abilities to process information. So all this to say, sort of a strong foundation in the early years really improves the odds for positive outcomes, right? Which you all know and I think work with every day. And a fragile foundation kind of increases the odds for later life difficulties without opportunities for mitigation. And I'll move off the brain in a minute, but it's important to understand sort of where some of the trauma responses that you might see in folks come from. So again, when thinking about the brain, when the stress response system in our brains, which is really adaptive and it's meant to handle stress really well, it starts our stress response system starts in the amygdala, which sits sort of in the middle of our brain. And I tell you where it sits because now we know sort of that's not the most sophisticated part of our brain. It's a pretty early developed part of our brain. And when you confront a stressor or a threat, the amygdala's job is to interpret that stressor, send a stress response system or signal the stress response system in the body to sort of turn on, where adrenaline and cortisol increase, so our heart rate goes up, our breath gets faster, our mouth dries up. And it signals to the body that it needs to protect itself. It gets hypervigilant, scans the environment for threats, and primes our brain to go into that fight, flight, or freeze, which I'm sure you've heard about or before. And our bodies are meant to handle that stress response. We have it a million times a day, right? And if I said right now you have to get up in the middle of the room and start dancing, right? For many people, that would probably start a stress response in your body. And that's what the body is supposed to do. It's like, hey, I don't know how to do that. I don't want to do it right now. That's the stress response protecting us, right? When stress, though, is not, but when I tell you, say you don't have to dance, right? What should happen is that your stress response subsides, right? So okay, I don't have to do that. And it sort of starts to calm, you feel calmer, right? So your heart rate might go down. You might sort of, lower your shoulders. You might just relax a little. And what you've done is just complete sort of this whole bell curve, right? That you've had the stress response go up. You've been at that sort of height of the stress response, and then you come down the other side when you know it's safe. Our bodies are meant to deal with that, right? But when there's chronic or cumulative or toxic stress, right? When we experience, say, abuse over and over, that's not what our brains are built for, okay? Because our bodies never get a chance to fully metabolize some of that stress response, okay? So our amygdala is always firing. So instead of our prefrontal cortex, which is where our logic and our emotion regulation and our complex decision making is sort of located, that's sort of the learning part of our brain. When we experience that stress response, it's that amygdala that's in charge. And when we have chronic or cumulative stress, that becomes in sort of the bus driver a lot more often than and not our prefrontal cortex, okay? And so two things happen when we have that chronic stress. One is that we are primed to go into that stress response much more easily. And so you might see folks who, sort of get triggered a lot more easily. Because their brains get used to sort of going into that stress response, okay? And the brain architecture itself changes. So communication pathways between different parts of our brains get disrupted. The ability to regulate or to cope, sort of that decreases, okay? And so chronic or cumulative toxic stress disrupts the brain architecture, and it makes this, and it primes us to go into the stress response much more easily if left unmitigated, okay? So if there is mitigation, if there is intervention, then we can sort of mitigate against some of those impacts. But the brain really gets affected by traumatic experiences, especially ones that happen over and over again. But I talked about sort of the opportunities for intervention and what's happening when we have sort of positive or protective factors. It's really the amazing capacity of our brain to change and to rewire, okay? So if we have adversity, but we also have positive experiences, right? The brain can begin to change its molecular, its architectural, and its functional organization in response to either sort of the negative things that may happen, but also the positive experiences that we might have over and over. It can be rewired when we have protective and positive experiences. And what the research is telling us, and we will talk more about this when we go through the HOPE model with you in a few months, I think, is that those positive experiences actually have greater impact on our development than the presence of adverse experiences. So it's really important to have these strong, protective, positive experiences. And those look like a strong support network, people helping us through adverse experiences, opportunities for engagement when we matter in people's lives. This helps us to have these positive experiences, which reduce some of those impacts of the trauma on the brain. Okay, it helps us learn emotion regulation to help that we don't engage in maybe some risky behaviors or things like that in order to cope, and we learn positive coping techniques. Another thing that becomes important is this idea of neurogenesis, which is the ability and the opportunity our brain has to actually develop new brain cells throughout our lifespan and preserve functioning in existing brain cells. So again, if you experience sort of trauma over and over and never get any mitigation in there, that affects those brain cells. But again, you have positive experiences. It can be really protective for our brain cells and increase connectivity instead of damaging it. Okay. And so we see things like when we have positive experiences that it preserves cognitive functioning throughout our lifespan. Okay. Whoops. And then the neural networks become stronger around positive experiences too. So the more intensely and frequently sort of we have these positive experiences, the stronger those brain signals get. So repetition is a good thing. And I know it's a lot of gobbledygook, and I want to talk about sort of why this matters. Okay. And as we think about recognizing trauma in folks, what we know is that, and I'm probably preaching to the choir on sort of why prevention efforts are important or why protective factors are important. But we want to understand why our systems have to be responsive to it too, not just us as individuals. Things like mental health, youth mental health, substance use, heart disease, violence in our homes or in our communities have a really common root cause, which is early trauma. And we know that about 70% of adults have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lives, and between about 16% have experienced 4 or more adverse experiences. In Maine, that's even higher. So we know that about 25% of our young people have experienced 4 or more adverse events in their lives. Okay, so you can think about how trauma is starting to impact youth, not just again at the time that they're young people, but throughout their lifespan. Because these adverse childhood experiences or trauma are linked to things like different causes of death, the top 5 types of leading causes of death. And then again, the sort of public health expenses that we might see. But when we address trauma on a policy level, on an organizational level, communities have seen things like a huge reduction in ER visits, reductions in school suspension rates, and then just a cost savings overall. Okay, so that's sort of why and the how of trauma, its impacts. Trauma can present differently for different people. There's no one way that survivors do or should respond. And what I hope that folks get out of this is not to memorize sort of, okay, what does it look like if from a cognitive perspective or a behavioral perspective? But there's just as there's a diversity in traumatic experiences, there's a diversity in presentation. And the goal is to be aware that that functioning can be impacted in dynamic ways and things can shift with time. So just because somebody comes in maybe feeling helpless or easily overwhelmed, if they get support and engagement, those feelings can shift over time, those emotions can shift over time when folks have access to healing and treatment and support. Okay. And we have to remember that agency has been taken away from most trauma survivors, and our interactions can offer the opportunity to restore that agency, that self-efficacy, which I think you all work hard on building, to build trust, to create positive experiences, and most importantly, not cause sort of further harm. So these are just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but it also sort of says that some people will only be sort of impacted in a cognitive way, okay? And other people may be more impacted in a behavioral way. Okay, it's rare that somebody's probably only going to be or show distress in one of these ways, but we tend to have trauma present in, more heavily in one of these columns, I would say, than in others. Although it's usually a mix of all the different ways. When we can begin to understand that trauma may be at the root of some of the behaviors that we see in folks, we can begin to reframe our own responses and address the underlying concerns that the behavior is a manifestation of. Okay, so we can reframe behaviors to understand how they're serving someone or that they've been developed in response to an experience. Okay, and this is a list you may have seen before, but I think it's important, again, just to point out that we might experience somebody as manipulative or say unmotivated, right? But when we sort of have this idea, this trauma-informed lens, we can understand that someone being manipulative is maybe someone not just sort of trying out to get us, but they're someone who's getting their needs met in ways that have worked in the past, or they're doing whatever is necessary to survive, right? That survival is the thing that is driving them more than anything. And that might be due to certain parts of their brains being impacted in the development, or them bubbling up into their stress response, that survival brain, much more easily, something like that. We could begin to understand that someone who appears unmotivated or unwilling to change is actually fearful or overwhelmed or frozen. And a lot of times folks who, if they have been met with a positive relationship in a system for one of the first times, they might be really fearful of losing that relationship too, right? So that if they're doing well, you'll actually go away. And that can feel really hard for some folks too. So you might see sort of different behaviors around that as well. Again, something like attention seeking might actually be someone feeling disconnected, alone, and unheard, okay? Why I mention this is not because we want to excuse some of these behaviors, right? It's because we can begin to understand and address what's actually at the root cause for them. Instead of looking at someone who's, say, unmotivated, if we can begin to understand that they might actually be overwhelmed or fearful of something, then we can address that behavior or that fear rather than the unmotivated, which just is the sort of the manifestation of some bigger root cause of something. Okay. So now that we're sort of on the same page, I know it's a lot of information with trauma and trauma presentations, let's talk about sort of what a trauma-informed system is like, okay? So knowing that there's no single risk factor or protective factor that accounts for who will experience trauma and who will not, that really speaks to the need for this sort of universal or population health approach, a universal precautions approach versus only treating those folks with disclosed trauma, right? So there are some sort of universal approaches that just get done for everybody. And then there are some things that we may need to intervene specifically for folks who we know have experienced trauma or we suspect it, but there are overall things that we can do for everybody. And I sort of think of it like a surgeon using gloves during a procedure, right? A surgeon doesn't go into the operating room and only glove up if they think someone has a communicable disease, right? They glove up universally and treat everybody with those same protocols, just to keep sort of everybody, including themselves, safe. Okay. And that's what trauma-informed is really about. It's sort of utilizing certain practices and policies that apply to everybody. And a trauma-informed lens asks that we really shift the conversation on this sort of meta level from what is wrong with you? Why do you act this way? Why do you smoke? Why don't you eat healthy foods? Why do you engage in risky behaviors? To what happened to you or what have your experiences been, thinking about that lens that lead to these challenging coping behaviors. So if we think of smoking or not eating healthy or engaging in risky behaviors as actually coping behaviors to deal with some sort of trauma or experience, then we can, again, we shift from this individual deficit model that something's wrong with somebody to, somebody has had some challenging behaviors or some challenging experiences that have led to sort of maladaptive coping behaviors. And let's think about how we can support them in changing some of those, okay? And how can we support their strengths that they already bring into this conversation, okay, or bring into this relationship? So again, we shift from an individually focused, deficit-based model to understanding behaviors and responses that we see are an attempt at coping with adverse events, and then to support these internal strengths for healing, okay? And being trauma-informed is about organizational or systems change, not just about individual practice. So it's an approach overall, not an individual intervention all by itself. And it's not an endpoint. It's a lens. It's a framework that's constantly applied and checked in with. Okay. So when we do things like design policies or design a space or form a group or hold a meeting, these are all opportunities to use a trauma-informed sort of lens. Okay. So trauma-informed, because of that universal practice is sort of the base of the triangle. And so we think about sort of what are these systems that we work in, right? How do we do intakes? How are meetings run? How do we interact with folks in our community? What are engagement strategies? Okay. It's the functioning of the organization. Okay. It's not a distinct practice like we practice trauma-informed care. It's really a lens, again, in which we view sort of all the operations. So that we can become trauma sensitive, so that where everyone in the organization is aware that trauma is prevalent, and bring some awareness around how trauma presents and how people might show up in our system. From sort of back-end processes, right? Finance, HR, operations, not just the client-facing operations. So it considers the way in which the entire organization understands trauma, even if they don't work directly on interventions, okay? And then trauma recovery, or that is the smallest part of the triangle. And that's really those trauma-specific interventions when trauma is known. Okay, so therapeutic services that really promote healing, symptom reduction, teaching skills, and that's that individual practice. Okay, so it's just, I want sort of to expand our thinking about what being trauma-informed means, although we can certainly practice in a trauma-informed way as individuals. Okay. Sometimes people, I think, walk away thinking like, well, so do we just accept all the behaviors that we see? And I mentioned this a little bit before, but the answer is really no. Trauma-informed care is not about excusing or permitting or justifying behaviors that aren't acceptable, right? We still hold people accountable. And really, trauma-informed care supports accountability and responsibility because hopefully limits are clear. And again, they're applied, things are applied equitably and consistently across the population. And people, and especially trauma survivors, actually tend to feel safer when the rules are clear and have that equitable application. It's sort of like learning to swim, right? If you swim, most people learn to swim in something like a swimming pool, and people versus the ocean. And people feel safer learning to swim in a swimming pool where they know that the sides are there, right? There are sort of clear boundaries for them. That feels a lot safer than being tossed out in the ocean and saying, learning to swim there where there aren't those clear boundaries, okay? It doesn't mean just being nicer, right? Compassion is a part of it, but it's not mushy compassion, right? It's still, it's about that accountability and with compassion, I would say, okay? So it's not just about being nicer, being sort of mushy. People will also see through that a mile away. And it doesn't mean that you focus on the negative or talk about trauma all the time. And in fact, just the opposite. Because we now know how prevalent trauma is, we can just assume that many of the folks who walk through the door have experienced trauma. And so and we really want to focus on promoting healing, right, and strengths and building relationship, okay? And it recognizes the strengths that people inherently have, right? And it honors their lived experience. And like I said before, it's not just an endpoint. It's not just one training, right? It's how we sort of support change to institutional and organizational policies, the physical environment, and incorporate wellness for both ourselves as staff and for our clients. These are the 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach that is from SAMHSA, again, which is really foundational to the development of practice. I'm not going to go into them a lot, but if you're looking for, well, what are the domains we're thinking about for a trauma-informed approach? These are the 6 domains that we're thinking about, okay? I think the ones that really probably are most applicable to our individual practice are sort of the ensuring sort of physical and psychological safety, the trustworthiness and transparency piece, that we're open and we're sort of about how we arrive at decisions and things like that, the collaboration and mutuality, and then the empowerment, voice, and choice, giving folks a sort of a voice in how they work with us. When we're not trauma informed, what happens, and this is from the research, is we know that it leads to early dropout or limited engagement with folks. So even if they come through our door, they may leave services sooner. So many of the clients I'm sure you see don't just need WIC programs, right? But they need other supports as well. But there's often a lack of connection to the other additional resources if somewhere isn't trauma informed. It can interfere with future help-seeking behaviors, and it can sort of at its worst inadvertently re-traumatize somebody, right? So they might experience another trauma on top of it if they get treated, poorly, or certain things happen. And how do systems do this last piece? Well, it could be that in an intake or an assessment, only problems or deficits are considered, right? Or someone has to explain their trauma over and over. That lack of coordination we talked about. So if somebody again comes in for a service here, but then has to go tell the exact same story next door for another, intake, and then again somewhere else, that can lead to some re-traumatization. Where there's a lot of unpredictability and not transparency around that can be re-traumatizing. And certainly in systems that are biased or discriminate against folks, some of those obvious ones, those can obviously impact and re-traumatize. All right. Any questions before I kind of move on to the lactation piece specifically, or parenting and lactation? I know it's, again, a lot to get through in a short period of time, but we'll shift to this now. And if folks have questions, that get generated, let me know. So this is from one research study about when parents have experienced trauma, that for many adult survivors, the capacity to offer warmth and nurturance is not limited if you've experienced trauma, but the confidence to believe in ourselves as competent caregivers is significantly depleted. I firmly believe that the vast, vast majority of caretakers and parents want to parent well, and there's, of course, always exceptions to any rule, but most parents or caregivers want to have happy, healthy children who they parent well. It's often not the capacity of the wanting that's limited, but someone's confidence to offer that gets limited. Okay, so it might be their confidence in themselves, right? Can I do this? And their ability to keep an infant or a child safe if they weren't kept safe as a young person, or in their body's capacity to stay regulated or to produce milk or do something like that. So their body's actual physical capacity. Or physiological capacity to stay safe. Some impacts of trauma on parenting, we know, is that the early onset abuse, so prior to the age of 5, seems to be more predictive of challenges in transitioning to parenthood than if trauma happened later. And again, if we go back to that idea of what's going on in the brain before the age of 5, that is where when there's abuse and trauma that's especially left unmitigated or unresolved, which I hate that term, but that's what the literature says. But unmitigated trauma from the prior to the age of 5 seems to tell us that folks may have more trouble transitioning into parenthood, especially as we consider how they might interact with their little one. Okay, so the what and the when of trauma can impact folks differently. And thinking about, if someone's been traumatized, the importance of nonverbal cues or of body language in early parenting. Young babies and young children obviously can't communicate through language, so they learn about the world through their facial reaction, through other people's facial reactions, their body language, their body cues, those things that a parent or caregiver offer. And those nonverbal cues are what help babies cue into what is safe or not. Okay, so when there's secure bonding, infants learn to trust through caregivers who model a kind of appropriate responses. So helping babies learn to regulate distress, all this, and negative emotions, right? Providing kids with feelings of comfort and being understood. That happens through body language, not through our words, because babies don't understand words, right? But trauma's sort of the first place trauma shows up is in our bodies. Okay. So when folks who experience trauma might become, really, really, constricted. Okay. And think about holding a baby and suddenly you get triggered and sort of your body tightens up, right? Or you have no capacity to regulate and calm yourself. Those are the messages that may get passed on to the baby about, and when they're learning about what's safe in the world and what's not, those become very powerful cues for them. Okay. Or we get triggered and our breath, gets faster, right? Our breath speeds up. That's a baby's trying to figure out what's safe or not, and you've got a parent or caregiver who's really has this physiological and physical reaction. And that's going to impact, again, this baby learning to self-soothe and its own manage its own distress. Okay. Versus when a parent or caregiver can talk, if a baby's distressed, say, if a parent or caregiver can talk in a calm voice, be relatively relaxed, or at least have a relaxed face. Okay. The baby's going to that's the signal for the baby to learn to regulate itself. Okay. So there can be so much disrupted sort of early learning around regulation with folks who might be holding a lot of trauma in their bodies. An unmitigated or unaddressed trauma or loss can interfere with a caregiver's expectations and perceptions of their own child, as well as their ability to sensitively respond. So what's interesting is, again, it may not be that a parent lacks capacity at all to respond, but they may have trouble responding to their own child. And we don't really seem to know what that is about, but that there's some inability to bond fully with their own child, whereas maybe they were a great aunt, right? But when they have their own child, there might be some disrupted attachment that occurs. And then I skipped one, that the history of interpersonal trauma appears to have impact parenting more than other types of trauma. Okay, so the development of safe relationships impacts this parent or this caregiver baby relationship as well. So those are some of the impacts on parenting in sort of on a whole. And then feeding interactions between parents and their children are considered really important contexts which children learn to identify and give sense to those verbal and nonverbal communications, right? And if you think about it, that makes sense. We talked about sort of how body language and nonverbal cues can be really important in those early years. And those feeding interactions, right? When you're holding a baby and looking down at the baby, that's a chance. And whether you're chest feeding or whether you're bottle feeding, that's a time when babies are looking up at us, right? And learning about those verbal and nonverbal, or those nonverbal cues a lot. And so feeding interactions are particularly sort of, they're either opportunities or they can be really vulnerable times for babies to learn a lot about the world from their parent or caregiver. Okay. So thinking about sort of trauma and parenting, how there might be disruptions to the relationship, due to early trauma, especially. I want to, think about trauma and lactation now. So the first thing is that trauma can interfere. Remember, again, I talked about the brain a little bit and the interactions between, or the disruptions that can happen in the development of the brain development due to trauma. And one thing that can get disrupted, especially, is the role of sort of accessing something like oxytocin, one of our happy hormones. Okay, so thinking about the role of our stress and pleasure systems in our bodies. So imagine, if you can, trying to chest feed with sort of a growling, angry tiger next to you, right? Not a friendly tiger, a really mean one, okay? The part of our brain that's going to be immediately in charge is our amygdala, right? Our stress response system is going to kick right in when we're sort of faced with a threat like that, okay? And what happens when that stress response or that survival response kicks in is that the pleasure system pretty much turns off. It's kind of like a light switch. If one's on, the other's off, okay? And why that impacts us is because, well, imagine first the physicality of it, right? If you're feeling stress, and when we kind of raise our shoulders and kind of constrict like this, it's an evolutionary reaction because we're trying to protect the soft tissues of our body. So that's why we do a lot of this. We're trying to protect sort of these main systems in our bodies. So we have this physical problem, right? That we're constricted and we're feeling tight, which is going to be a real challenge to chest feed. But it also interrupts that pleasure system in our body. And the oxytocin is a critical component of milk ejection. Okay, so that initial letdown response. If we can't access that oxytocin, that pleasure hormone in our brain, it's going to be really challenging for that initial letdown, the initial latch, the initial sort of initiation of breastfeeding in any given session. Okay. And then, of course, sort of when that initial letdown response doesn't happen, you've all seen this a million times, folks become frustrated, right? And then they feel like they can't do it and they want to give up. And then we're in a whole cycle, right? Which makes it even harder to ask them to re-engage with chest feeding. So trauma is like that can be like that tiger in the room, okay? And imagine too, if that tiger is a constant presence, it's sort of maybe not sitting right next to us, but it's wandering around and it's this constant sort of fear that somebody has. Okay. And it could be because the trauma is ongoing, say in a case of domestic violence, that there's real violence happening at any given moment, or it could be the memory of it too, right? Like that somebody's had that experience in the past, but they're constantly sort of, it's constantly sort of bubbling up for them. Okay. So this access to the oxytocin for that initial letdown is going to be really challenged for many of our survivors. Trauma survivors also feel a disconnection from their body or use something called dissociation as a coping technique. That feeling of disconnection is actually helpful to them. And this, again, is true often for survivors of early childhood abuse, where being disconnected was the way they survived. Again, you can imagine if somebody's trying to use their body to feed, this can be also a very overwhelming experience. Okay. And so those physical demands of feeding and the care of the body that it requires, this can be a huge challenge for survivors, not feeling as if they can sort of exist in their bodies and they physically feel disconnected from it. Imagine trying to get a baby to latch on. That's going to be hard. So it may be learning to regulate themselves before that they even attempt to feed. For many trauma survivors, and I know, again, I worked for years with folks who experienced sexual abuse, and that physical touch of any kind, any closeness with other humans could be very hard and very unwelcome, right? Remember that something like sexual abuse is most often perpetrated by someone known to you. And so when closeness has been the enemy, it's hard to change that narrative when you suddenly have a little baby that depends on you. So holding a baby or having a baby close to you may be incredibly uncomfortable. And that idea of human touch of any kind feels really terrible, whether it comes from ourselves having to sort of manipulate to get to chest feed, the baby being close, or a provider even trying to help you. Okay, so that physical touch is sort of a barrier in and of itself. And then many folks who've experienced trauma or adversity might have a disrupted support system or don't have close family members to help support them sort of in this endeavor at all. And I think all of us can think about how important a support system is just in having a baby, right? But also in I think in chest feeding, especially having folks who believe in you, who want to help you, who think that you're a competent, parent. And many survivors lack this support system. And simply sort of the unpredictable nature of babies and when they want to feed can be another challenge for folks. And some, again, childhood sexual abuse survivors have named that being woken up in the middle of the night is particularly challenging because it may remind them of the time of their abuse, right? That they were often woken up. It might be that they, the lack of control that they, that they feel out of control. Babies waking on their own schedules is pretty much the opposite of feeling in control, right? It's also a time of isolation, right? You wake up in the middle of the night to feed, whether you're chest feeding or bottle feeding. Many parents report feeling very, very alone and isolated at that time of night, especially. So this can be sort of a triggering experience for some. And then I mentioned before this idea of complex trauma. And birth trauma is, again, very common. About 45% of new mothers experience childbirth as traumatic, all new mothers, but in particular, Black women and women of color are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience dangerous and life-threatening complications, and more likely to report mistreatment and neglect from providers and staff during childbirth, right? And so we have this idea of birth and being a traumatic experience for many people. And you layer that, or that intersects with pre-existing traumas, and this again can be a really vulnerable time for folks. From one study of women who experienced lactation challenges, some of the feelings they reported included guilt, loss, feeling misled about probably how easy it was, anxiety, feeling scarred, failure. These are the same as trauma reactions, right? So they may not name that chest feeding is traumatic, but that if these are the reactions that they're naming for when they have challenges, this feels very similar. There's a parallel experience to trauma reactions as well. Okay, so again, if you have both, it's again a very vulnerable time. I think I'm going to skip this part and end here and leave a few minutes for questions for folks. Any thoughts or things that and I'll stop sharing actually. Anything that you are curious about, you want to hear more about, things that are on your mind, or specific questions that you have around some of this. Again, I know I talked through the brain part really quickly. Let me stop sharing here. But what comes to mind for folks?
There's a question in the chat, Melissa, about obtaining the handouts.
Oh, from the slide, you want the slides? Yeah, I will get Ginger. I'll get you a copy of the slides, and folks, you're welcome to them. I'm happy to share those.
Oh, thank you so much. That's awesome. And I did notice some forwarding of this meeting, so I appreciate you. Ask your coworkers if they are on Lunch and Learn emails, and if they're also on weekly update emails. And if they're not, ask them to email me or send me their emails, because folks get missed here and there. So we do want to make sure everybody's on. Everybody that joined, thank you so much. And I just have one comment, Melissa, is we know this stuff. Why don't we treat new parents better? Why aren't we more tender so that we have more positive experiences for, our entire future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Right. I think that's the shift in the lens. I think, Ginger, a little bit is that we all sort of have to commit to, I think, is noticing when we react to something, can we intentionally slow down a little bit and be curious about where that reaction is coming from, is sort of one option I want to offer folks. Is we are so busy and there's so much overwhelm, I know, and sort of to get through people, and I know visits are often very short. But here's what I would offer is I think sometimes we contribute to our own frustration in that, and I'm guilty of this too. We need to get across so much information, right? And we need to tell folks so much stuff that's important. But we forget to sort of check in with them and see if they are able to even absorb it. And so then we feel frustrated when they come back because they haven't done something, or they've missed something, they haven't, done a task that we've assigned them, whatever it is. But I think for folks coming into some of these situations, giving them a chance to land, to take a moment to regulate themselves, can sort of pay huge dividends for us in the back end of sort of our process with them. Because if they're dysregulated coming in, right, they have to enter into a system which might, in general might be hard for them to walk into an office, or they may fear being judged or something like that. If we can take a moment and help make sure they're regulated before we try to get a lot of information out to them, I think then we will have there's a lot higher likelihood of sort of sustained engagement. Because, I tell this to teachers all the time, but I forget it too. We expect kids, say in a busy hallway at school, all that chaos, to suddenly sit down and pay attention in class. Their bodies aren't ready to do that. Their bodies and brains need a chance to regulate. And I think adults are the same way. So if we have adults walking into our office and sitting down, give just a minute to settle and land. And we'll talk about that as a strategy next week too. Just sort of how do you enter into a conversation with somebody just to make sure they're regulated so that their learning brain is sort of turned on and it's not their survival brain that's sort of driving the bus. Because that's what happens with a lot of survivors. We think we've told them everything they need to know, but have they been able to absorb it? Probably not. Yeah, but you're right. Parenting in general is just a hard transition. Forget sort of the lactation piece, but parenting in general is just a huge for new parents, especially, but all parents, right? It's hard. So I think the leaning into to when we notice ourselves have a reaction, we go to that old response of somebody's being, manipulative or someone's being lazy or someone's being inattentive. Can we actually be a little more curious about what might be underlying some of that? What about any other questions or things that you want to talk about next week? In 2 weeks, that you're running into as challenges in your own practices? That's fine if not. So I'll get the slides over to you, and then next time we'll talk more about now that we understand sort of trauma and how it impacts parenting and how it impacts chest feeding and lactation, how do we actually engage with folks? How do we use some of what we've learned today to maybe help our practice, our individual practice at least, become sort of a little more trauma informed? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I know it's a busy lunch hour, and again, you're trying to do so much, and I appreciate all that you do, and how well you work with people, and look forward to being with you again in a couple of weeks.
Thanks so much, Melissa. That's right. In 2 weeks, the 25th, we'll be back here at 11. We'll finish this conversation. It was so good and so rich for you guys. We wanted to make sure it was thoroughly covered, so we split it into 2. And until then, I hope everyone had a good Easter or whatever holiday you celebrated. I do so appreciate that you just gave us an hour of your time. I know you're so busy. So thankful. And thank you all for all that you do. Angela and Emily, we're going to get you added to those email lists, and apologies. But thank you so much for speaking up. And again, speak to your coworkers. If they're not on either list, let us know. Thanks so much, you guys, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Take care, everyone.